He insulted my home, humiliated my wife and called her a careerist from bed. I grabbed the bastard by the collar and threw him out of our yard. My name is Ben, I'm 30 years old and I run a small business that after years of uncertainty and trial and error, has finally found its rhythm and started doing well. It's not flashy or high profile but it's mine, something I built from scratch, and there's a quiet pride in knowing that each success was earned 1 inch at a time. My wife, Lauren, is 28 and works as a director in a large corporation, a title that still feels surreal to her sometimes, especially considering it's her first real job since graduating from university. She's sharp, ambitious, and carries herself with a kind of quiet intensity that commands respect in every room she walks into. Watching her rise so quickly in her field has been incredible, even if it sometimes leaves me standing on the sidelines wondering how we got here. Two people with completely different work lives trying to keep a shared one from slipping through the cracks. Last summer, after years of saving, planning and sketching designs on napkins during late-night conversations, we finally built our dream home just outside of Nashville, a place that felt like both an achievement and a beginning. Every detail, from the layout of the kitchen to the color of the front door, was something Lauren and I decided on together, blending our styles into a space that felt undeniably ours. We chose the furniture piece by piece, arguing playfully over fabric swatches and finishes until the house started to reflect not just our taste but our memories. Because we've always loved hosting, the first thing we did once we settled in was throw a massive summer party, the kind we used to daydream about when we lived in our cramped apartment downtown. There was a barbecue on the back patio, music playing through speakers hidden in the landscaping, kids splashing in the pool, and coolers stocked with everything from soda to wine. More than 50 people came, friends, co-workers, neighbors, even a few family members who made the drive, and for one long warm evening, it felt like we were living inside the exact life we had once only imagined. A few days before the party, while we were finalizing the guest list and double-checking the food orders, Lauren brought up one name with a kind of hesitance I wasn't used to hearing from her: Carl, her former boss. She told me, almost in passing but with a look that asked for understanding, that he had been toxic during their time working together, the kind of person who thrived on subtle power plays and undermining others to feel important. She admitted she didn't really want him there, but she felt pressured to invite him anyway because leaving him out might create unnecessary tension at the office, especially now that she was in a leadership role herself. She made it clear that she didn't expect me to like it, just to let it go for the day. If he says something unpleasant, just ignore it, she said, and I could tell she was trying to manage it all, her career, her image, the party, without letting any of it collapse. I nodded, told her I'd keep my cool, but a part of me was already unsettled, wondering why we had to make space in our home for someone who had made hers so uncomfortable. Carl arrived late, long after most of the guests had already settled in with drinks and plates of food, and I spotted him walking up the driveway alone, wearing sunglasses even though the sun had started to dip behind the trees. I stepped forward to greet him, offered a handshake and kept my tone polite, doing exactly what Lauren had asked. He returned the gesture with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. That changed the moment Lauren approached. As soon as she came into view, his demeanor shifted noticeably. His posture stiffened, the smile dropped from his face, and his entire tone turned passive-aggressive in that subtle, cutting way that's hard to call out directly but impossible to miss. He made a vague comment about how some people get lucky young, and followed it with a quiet laugh that wasn't meant to be shared. Lauren didn't flinch, just kept her face neutral, but I saw the way her jaw tensed. He didn't raise his voice or say anything overtly cruel, but his presence alone seemed to sour the air around him. During the tour of the house, as we walked him through the spaces we had poured so much thought and care into, Carl made a point of commenting on nearly everything with a thin layer of disdain that he barely tried to hide. When we stepped into the living room, he looked up and asked, "Why is the ceiling so high?" in a tone that made it clear he didn't see it as an architectural choice but some kind of indulgence. When we showed him the guest house, something we had been genuinely proud of, partly for hosting family, partly as a flexible space for the future, he raised an eyebrow and muttered, "A guest house is unnecessary, aren't you trying to impress someone?" It wasn't just the words themselves but the way he said them, with a smirk and a pause, like he wanted us to feel embarrassed about the things we had worked so hard to build. Lauren stayed quiet beside me, her smile tight and unmoving, but I could feel the tension rising in her shoulders, and in that moment, I had to remind myself again of the promise I had made, not to react, not to let him ruin the day. Lauren let out a nervous laugh, the kind that didn't carry any real amusement but served as a fragile attempt to smooth over the moment, her eyes flicking toward me as if silently pleading for patience. I stayed silent, jaw tight, doing everything I could to restrain myself from saying something I'd regret, reminding myself over and over that this was her request, that this was her night too. But as Carl continued his string of condescending remarks, it became clear that we weren't the only ones affected. The other guests, especially those standing nearby, started shifting uncomfortably, their smiles fading and their conversations trailing off. You could feel it in the air, that awkward pause after every one of his comments, that subtle tension where lightheartedness used to be. He wasn't just ruining the mood between us, he was starting to cast a shadow over the entire event. Later in the evening, after the tour and a few drinks had loosened the atmosphere again, Carl wandered back over and started asking questions that felt less like curiosity and more like thinly veiled challenges. He looked at me with that same smug expression and asked, "So, who paid for all this construction? Is it all on your salary?" His tone was casual, but the implication behind his words was clear, and for a second, I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest. I met his gaze, kept my voice steady, and simply said, "That's personal," before smoothly redirecting the conversation towards something safer, asking about a mutual acquaintance from Lauren's company just to steer us away from the edge. He let it go, at least outwardly, but the moment sat between us like a splinter, sharp and unresolved, and I could feel Lauren watching from across the patio, her expression unreadable. At dinner, just as the sun was setting and the patio lights began to glow softly above us, one of our co-workers leaned over with a genuine smile and complimented us on the yard, saying how beautifully everything came together, from the landscaping to the layout. Lauren smiled and said proudly that we had designed it ourselves, how we had spent weeks sketching ideas and working with a local team to make it exactly what we wanted. It was one of the few light, happy moments that evening had offered. And then, right on cue, Carl cut in from the other end of the table with a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Don't ask me how much it cost. That's classified information for the upper class." There was a pause, the kind that sours the mood in an instant, and a few people chuckled nervously while others looked away, clearly unsure how to respond. Lauren's smile faltered, and I stared down at my plate, gripping my fork a little too tightly. His words weren't just a joke, they were a jab, another thinly veiled insult dressed as humor, and the worst part was that he knew exactly what he was doing. I couldn't stand it any longer, not the tension in Lauren's face, not the way our guests were trying to pretend they hadn't heard him, and definitely not the smug satisfaction in his voice every time he delivered another one of his barbed comments. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my tone calm but unmistakably firm, and asked him directly, "Do you have a problem?" For a moment he blinked, clearly surprised that someone had finally called him out, and he tried to brush it off with a shrug, mumbling something vague about just joking around. But then, without even trying to hide the venom behind his words, he said, "I'm just wondering how your wife can afford such a house. Obviously you pay everything." The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and bitter, and for a second no one at the table moved or spoke. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation, an insult wrapped in mock curiosity, aimed not just at me but at Lauren too, undermining her success, our partnership, everything we had worked for. And that was the moment I knew I wasn't going to let this slide. Not anymore. I looked him straight in the eye, no longer willing to hold back, and said with quiet but absolute certainty, "This is our house. We built it together. And you have no right to humiliate that, especially not here in our home, surrounded by our friends." For a second, it looked like he might back down, like maybe the weight of being confronted would finally shut him up, but instead he snapped, his voice louder, uglier, and with a sneer that made my stomach turn, he said, "She just slept around to get this position in this life." The words were like acid, burning through whatever thin veneer of civility had been left, and I could see Lauren freeze beside me, her face draining of color as the air went still. It wasn't just an insult, it was a deliberate, cruel attempt to cut her down in front of everyone, to strip away her success and turn it into something shameful. And in that moment, I didn't care about appearances or promises or keeping the peace. He had crossed a line that no one could come back from. Without thinking twice, I stood up, grabbed him by the collar, and pushed him toward the door with a force I didn't know I still had in me, the weight of everything he'd said boiling over in that single moment. He didn't resist, too stunned to react, his expression shifting from smugness to something closer to confusion, like he couldn't quite believe someone had finally stood up to him. The room behind us had gone silent, but I didn't look back. I marched him across the patio, past the lights and the laughter he had soured, and out the front door, letting the night swallow him. Before I closed it, I looked him dead in the eye and said, slowly and clearly, "If you open your mouth again, I will call the police." He stood there, blinking like he was waking from a dream, and then turned without another word. I shut the door, locked it, and leaned against it for a moment, breathing hard, knowing I had just shattered the peace of the night, but also knowing I had protected something far more important. When I walked back into the house, the energy that had once filled it was gone, replaced by an uneasy quiet that settled over the guests like dust after a storm. Most people had already started gathering their things, their conversations hushed, their eyes flicking toward me with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort. In the corner of the living room, Lauren sat surrounded by a few close friends who were clearly trying to comfort her, offering soft words and gentle touches, but nothing seemed to reach her. Her eyes found mine as I approached, and they were filled with tears, not anger, not even shock, but something more complicated, something that looked like disappointment. She stood slowly and whispered, "You shouldn't have interfered." Her voice was low, not sharp, but heavy with emotion, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. I had thought I was protecting her, protecting us, but now I wasn't sure if I had made things worse by doing exactly what I thought needed to be done. We had a fight later that night, the kind that starts in a whisper and builds slowly until everything that had been bottled up finally spills out. She was upset, not just because of what Carl had said, but because of how I had handled it, telling me through clenched teeth that I had ruined her evening, that I might have jeopardized her professional relationships and made things more complicated at work. Her voice cracked as she spoke, torn between frustration and exhaustion, and I could see how much the entire night had weighed on her. I tried to explain as calmly as I could, that I had held back for as long as possible, that I had done everything she asked until Carl crossed a line so vile I couldn't ignore it. I told her that no matter what he meant to her job or her career, I wasn't going to stand there and let someone humiliate her, especially not in our own home in front of our friends, while she stood there fighting to stay composed. It wasn't about pride or ego. It was about respect, and the moment Carl reduced her success to something disgusting, any restraint I had left disappeared. A week later, word spread through Lauren's office that Carl had resigned, and the news landed with far less shock than either of us expected. Apparently, the incident at our party hadn't stayed within our walls. Several co-workers who had been there had shared what happened, and it didn't take long for the story to circulate. Rather than sympathy, Carl became the target of ridicule. One co-worker, Lauren told me, even imitated the moment I pushed him out of the house during a team lunch, complete with mock outrage and stumbling backward. It wasn't professional maybe, but it was honest, and for the first time I saw Lauren smile when she talked about it. Her co-workers weren't upset that I stood up to him. On the contrary, most of them were relieved. They were glad someone had finally put him in his place, and for once, Lauren didn't have to explain or defend herself. The shadow he had cast for so long was finally gone, and it hadn't been her silence that made it disappear. It was someone refusing to let it stay. Lauren still carries a little guilt with her, even now, weeks later when the dust has fully settled and life has returned to its usual rhythm. Sometimes I catch her falling quiet when his name comes up, or when someone mentions the party, and I know she's still wondering if she could have handled it differently, if it spiraled because she brought him into our space. But every time I remind her gently, it's not your fault. He destroyed himself. Because he did. No one pushed him into that behavior, no one fed his ego or gave him those words. He chose them and he paid the price. And somehow, over time, even that night has softened into something we can laugh about. Now, at every party we host, there's always someone who raises a drink and jokes, "Hey, don't grab my collar." And the room erupts with laughter. It's become part of the story, a strange chapter in what we've built together. One where I didn't just defend our home, but reminded everyone in it that respect doesn't get a free pass, not even from someone in a suit.